All right, here's what you really need to know about tide heights and the strength of the tide. In many cases, redfish move about a zone or a flat or a given back bay based on what the tide height is. The tide height is the vertical height of the water, which allows it to get up and get in behind these islands here and into these little creeks and lagoons. So you're going to have a higher tide height to even look in there. If the tide is low, don't look in the zones where they're likely not going to be because you caught one there 3 months ago. You have to understand, when you're taking your notes in your logbook, when you catch a fish, understand where the tide height was. Is it at the bottom of those limbs? Is it down where you can see the roots? Is the mullet groove activity a little bit further out and the fish are a little bit further out? So you have to understand, if you're at the lowest part of the tide, you're probably going to be further off the bank. If you're at the highest part of the tide, you're probably going to be right up on the bank. And the mid-tide zone is going to be right there, you know, where you see potholes and the oyster bars are barely covered. Those are all going to be the good spots to fish in the mid-tide period. Now, for me, the strength of the tide will matter if they're feeding on finfish more than anything else. If you have a strong tide and it's pulling minnows or pulling mullet out of a certain zone and they're feeding at a creek mouth. But in most cases, tide height is going to matter more than tide strength with redfish. For those of you that live in the Carolinas or Northeast Florida or the Georgia Low Country, you already know this, because the middle part of the tide, when the strength is the greatest, where you have the most horizontal movement of tide, it's almost impossible to fish. You have to have a lot of weight and the water's dirty. You're waiting for the slower parts of the tide. That's why I often say tide height is more important in red fishing than tide strength. Now let's move on to 4, our next point that we're going to make here in what you really need to know.